Sarah Kate Ellis, president and CEO of GLAAD, a media advocacy organization working to accelerate acceptance for LGBTQ people, tweeted yesterday, "The New York Times has long had a reputation as a leader in the world of media, but the example they are setting for coverage of transgender people is downright shameful."
GLAAD wrote, "For more than a year, the New York Times has stood for irresponsible, biased coverage of transgender people. The Times has repeatedly platformed cisgender people spreading inaccurate and harmful misinformation about transgender people and issues. This is damaging to the paper's credibility, and it is damaging to all LGBTQ people." Author and reporter Lisa Selin Davis wrote a response letter to GLAAD about the New York Times' coverage in a new Substack piece and joins us now to discuss. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So let us know what your argument was in response to the New York Times letter.
I actually agree with GLAAD that the New York Times has engaged in irresponsible and biased reporting, but I disagree about the specifics. I think the New York Times has been reporting in an impossibly narrow way, especially about kids and gender medicine. And they've been ignoring the stories of the many, many people and families who've gotten hurt by the affirmative method. So I do think that they're biased in a way.
So, sorry, you just broke up a little bit there, but I think we've got you back. I wonder what you make. I think that there's an argument that people have been making for a while that there has been absolutely no coverage, let's say, of detransitioners, of people who, let's say, are perhaps provided treatment earlier than it should have been provided, et cetera. And that having some balance there, having even a discussion of transitioners, which wasn't really the norm until relatively recently, is a move in the positive direction. At very least, there shouldn't be a ban or complete exclusion of talking about the reality of the world, even if in the same way that it can be uncomfortable to talk about people who lie about rape. Of course, some people, even though they're in the extreme minority, do lie about rape. But other people say that the trajectory of the coverage leads to the other problem in the reverse, which is, for example, someone like Matt Walsh, who was recently questioned about, well, how many women or how many people do you think ultimately do get transition surgery every year? And he wildly overestimated by orders of magnitude. And I wonder what you make of how to achieve a balance that approximates truth and doesn't lead to a kind of a moral panic about something that is still relatively uncommon.
Well, we don't know how many, especially young people, transition. And I'm personally unconcerned with what adults do with their bodies. And I work with many adult trans people who are concerned about the way this conversation is going or not going. But as far as kids go, we don't know. We don't know how many transition. We don't know how many get hurt. We don't know how many are happy. We have very poor data collection in this country. And when you have journalists and advocacy groups calling for less daylight, less coverage, that's not a good thing. We need more. We need to understand what's happening in the clinics. We need to know what's happening in these families. We need to follow the trajectory of the children. And we especially need to pay attention to the science. And one of the most shocking things about this GLAAD letter is that it asserts the science is settled. That is absolutely not true. Just because some medical organizations have endorsed the affirmative model of care doesn't mean the science is settled. In fact, all over the world, many clinicians and countries and their healthcare systems are rethinking the approach to treating gender dysphoric youth because of bad outcomes, because the people asking for interventions are very different than the people on whom the research was conducted. We need more daylight on this, not less. Censorship is not the answer. It's something we need to all be looking at and talking about. And the idea that listening to the science and the evidence, that listening to those who've gotten hurt is somehow bigoted or hateful or right-wing, that's outrageous. And it amazes me that journalists sign the letter, because it's their job to find out the whole story. And I've only been advocating that we find out the whole story.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I just had to push back on one aspect of that you said that we don't have the numbers, but what I was referring to was Matt Walsh on the Joe Rogan show, biggest podcast in the country, saying, quote, that there were millions of youths who were on hormone blockers, millions of young people on hormone blockers. And in real time, they fact-checked it on the show and found that the actual number was 4,780. Again, there's a lot of ways you can collect data. I don't know exactly what the numbers are. I appreciate that there isn't complete transparency when we're trying to measure anything. How many kids are in poverty? How many kids are abused? It's difficult to get specific numbers on any of that. But there does seem to be a very wide gap between what Matt Walsh's perception of the issue is, the size and scope of the issue or the threat or however you want to characterize it, and what the reality is. And I wonder, I completely appreciate wanting to make sure that the stories of detransitioners, et cetera, don't get blacklisted or censored. But is there any concern that there's a way that this kind of the coverage of these issues is leading people like Matt Walsh to believe other wrong facts in the other direction? And that can also be contributing to the slate of anti-trans legislation that's been coming down that is doing things like banning dressing even in drag, which I think most people see as a kind of infringement that's very anti-freedom.
Yes, I have a lot to say about that, and I'll try to be concise. Matt Walsh is not a good spokesperson for this issue. And I have constantly implored the left to get involved. We must admit that there are things going horribly wrong with this, and we must become part of reform, because otherwise we cede the issue to people like Matt Walsh, who believe women belong in the kitchen, etc. So the media has been really guilty of framing this as a left-right issue, but it really isn't. Many of the kids getting involved in this are actually the children of more left-wing people. And I should say the teenagers, because there are very different cohorts, and that's an important part of understanding the science, is that there are childhood onset gender dysphoric kids who are a really, really different group from these teens who are suddenly coming out as trans and demanding medical interventions. So it's really not a left-right issue. And dissenting, questioning, wanting to understand it in full, none of that is hateful, bigoted, or right-wing. So when I see this GLAAD letter and the New York Times letter from the contributors repeating those talking points, that questioning is bigotry, it makes me nervous that all of these voices will continue to be silenced. We can't fact check really how many kids are on puberty blockers. Reuters did an analysis with an insurance company, but we don't know. It's probably not millions. It's probably many more than 4,000. And meanwhile, we don't have long-term data on the effect of puberty blockers. But when GLAAD says, oh, these have been used for years, well, they have, not for this condition, in much younger kids who've gone through puberty, what the medical industry deems too early. And many of those people grew up and sued the makers of puberty blockers for the long-term damage to their health. So it's interesting about, look, we're such a small group, we're not worth reporting on. But then sometimes the argument is, hey, we're millions of people in this population, so we deserve coverage.
I don't think the argument is that they're not worth reporting on because the group is small. I think the argument is that people believe the group is much bigger than it is, and there's an effort to make it seem like it's a bigger issue in order to draw political focus to it and perhaps even distract people from other political issues that they might otherwise be voting on, economic populism, et cetera, that the Republican Party likes to perhaps give lip service to but not deliver on. I mean, I think that's the argument. I certainly don't think there's any group that's so small that if something bad is truly happening, it's not worth paying attention to. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think you could argue that it's a small group, but in schools throughout America, kids are learning to think about gender quite differently than old Gen Xers like myself. We were reared on free to be you and me, that we need not be limited by stereotypes, that we can have any job, that we can wear any clothes, that we can defy gender stereotypes. But there's been a massive shift in how young people are learning about gender. And now they're learning that it's a feeling that you have inside yourself, an innate feeling. And that if you have a certain feeling about yourself, you can change your body to match that. And that is a very, very different way of thinking about gender. So, and it is part of, besides social media and some other factors, part of this relative explosion of trans kids, or an exponential increase, sometimes a 4,000 or 5,000% increase at some clinics, of kids seeking medical interventions. So maybe there are 10, 15, 20,000 kids on puberty blockers, maybe many more. We don't know.
And maybe just 4,000.
Maybe just 4,000. I doubt that. But just because of how many I know myself. But I think
I know zero. You know, so that's the thing about anecdotal evidence.
Well, before we're going to have to wrap here in a second, but I wanted you to react. Yeah, so your piece is great on Substack. I encourage everyone to read it. And you mentioned that the UK, Sweden, and Finland have done these reviews of how gender care is being handled and have decided to kind of reverse course. There's also a great post for Barry Weiss's The Free Press recently, written by someone who worked in a clinic for young people to get gender-affirming care, who is like totally supportive or has been supportive of the work being done, but talks about trends over time that have distressed her, specifically in how easy and immediate the recommendation of care, such as puberty blockers, is when the patient talks to the doctor. And I think that is something that alarmed me, because I don't think I'm in the position of saying that I want this banned for anyone, including for kids. I generally, it's not my business. What families want to do and work out with their doctors is not my business. But I would want at least the process to be rigorous, or to make sure this is actually in the child's best interest, or even actually what the child wants. And we're seeing, I think, alarm bells being sounded about whether the process before prescription is rigorous and thorough enough to make sure that's the right course of action for every kid who walks into one of these clinics.
Yeah, I think the bans really get in the way, because then what we end up focusing on is Republicans terrorizing gender diverse people. And we don't want the government telling us what we can do for our kids or what our kids can do. We want medical associations and clinics and to create guidelines based on evidence, and we want to create policy out of cost-benefit analysis. We cannot do that if we are not acknowledging the costs. So I agree with Briahna. There are some terrible laws. There are some terrible laws coming out of the left also, frightening kind of reactions to what the Republicans are doing. And we need the media. If no one else is going to do this, we need the media to listen to all of these different voices. Censorship is not the answer.
Well, we have reached out to GLAAD for comment and have invited the organization's president and CEO, Sarah Kate Ellis, to join us to continue this conversation. Lisa, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.